Hey there, my name is Shane Craddock, and this is the Inner Edge podcast, where I share a different take on how to lead and live a sustainable, high-performance life. Over the course of different episodes, I'm going to challenge the belief that tension, stress, and struggle are essential to success and creativity. My experience is that there's an easier way, there's a better way, and indeed there's an essential way that we need to explore for the times that we live in. So let's go ahead, let's jump in and explore. Hello there, and welcome to today's podcast episode with me, Shane Craddock, on the Inner Edge. I hope wherever you are in the world that you're good, and that all is well around you, and also that you're not listening too much to the inner voice. That sometimes that can be hard on ourselves. And I suppose that's maybe a little bit of a logical lead in my head into today's episode, which I'm calling how to tap into your own wisdom and intuition more. Now, most people, I think, know instinctively and experientially that they have an intuition. Now, it'll often get expressed in words like, I just had a gut feeling, or I just kind of knew, or my instinct was, I couldn't fully explain why, I just had this instinct. And I think that seems to be a universal human experience when you're chatting with people, that it comes out and people kind of understand what you mean by it. Having said that, I think especially when you're kind of dealing with a lot with business people, very often, sometimes they're suspicious, in my experience, of the word intuition in kind of group settings. Even though the best leaders that I've ever worked with, entrepreneurial and corporate, they'll all talk about the fact that they really do trust and rely on their intuition. The intellect and reasoning has got huge value, very important. But when it comes to the big decisions, really the best I've ever worked with, and I've seen it for myself, you have to rely on a different part of you, a different part of your mind, the deeper part of your mind, which is what I'm going to call your wisdom or your intuition, or that kind of deep knowing. And certainly when you're facing a big decision, your rational mind can interfere with that and block it, because it'll go with the pros and cons. It loves to analyze, what about this and what about that. It loves to project into the future about different scenarios, all of which are useful, but not when it comes to actually making the big decision. And at one of my programs this week, I'm in the middle of running my Mind Shift program, and one of the attendees asked me a question, which I suppose has kind of inspired this podcast in a way, which is, how do you know which voice is kind of speaking inside? Like, is it the rational part of you, or is it that wisdom part? I mean, you could have plenty of funny conversations around that. Well, hopefully there's only a couple of voices, not loads of voices. Otherwise, we've got a different type of mental problem. Anyway, so for this purposes of this episode and what I'm talking about, I'm going to say there's two main voices that you have inside, right? There's one that I would encourage you to develop the inner skill to hear it more. And then the other one, I'm going to say, you take it sparingly. Now, the first thing that I will say, just in case you're coming into this new, you don't know me, you haven't listened to any of the other podcasts for whatever reason, the other episodes, is that this might be a little bit confusing because, for example, I'm going to say you, the real you in terms of your potential, are not your inner voice. And the bit that might be saying, what voice is he talking about? That's the voice I'm talking about. So I think one of the single biggest things you can ever learn as a human, but also in terms of your development and your potential for growth, is to realize that inner voice is not actually the real you. It's a part of your inner world. It's a part of your mind. I'm going to say that for most people, that inner voice is actually coming from the rational mind, which really is coming from the past, right? Now, that's a whole other kind of conversation. I'm not going to get distracted by that one. But you're not your inner voice. Okay, so that's my working assumption. It's not my assumption. I'm just saying that's how I look at it, but that's also my experience. That's my knowing. Now, just to tell you a very personal story, I'm very happily married, thankfully, to TLJ, the lovely Judy. But not everybody knows that, as can often happen in relationships, you have to take, sometimes the rough with the smooth, etc. That's part of it, just like sailing. But we broke up actually for about 6-7 months. And when we broke up, as far as I was concerned, I think as Judy's concerned, that was it. Like it was over. And I used to always remember somebody saying to me, "Look, if it's meant to be, it'll come back." But I mean, in my head, that was rubbish. But I guess that's what happened. But I always remember um, just before we broke up, that I remember we were having these fights and everything else, and we were away on holidays, I think in somewhere in south of France at the time. And I remember we'd had a fight, and I just walked out of where we were staying, and I went down to the water. There was loads of boats, and I remember it was a clear sky. I was looking up at the moon, and I felt miserable. And I just remember looking up, at whatever I thought was out there, kind of going like, what am I to do here? Like, what's the right thing to do? And then I just forgot about it. But I remember just getting very calm, and out of that calmness, I don't know how long it was after that moment, but just came a very clear kind of thought or knowing, you need to break up. You need to talk this out and then just step away. Both of you need to break up. And while after that, I got caught up with my rational mind at times, and well, maybe it's the right thing, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't. I kept coming back to that feeling. And so it was a thought that had a feeling or a knowing, and I just knew that's what I had to do, even though it brought with it a lot of pain, even though it brought with it a lot of uncertainty. And that's what happened. And I think as far as I said, we were both concerned, that was the end of it. Like, our relationship was over. But little we realized, and when we met again 6 months later, I think we'd both changed. I think we both had seen things differently. And after a few meetings, we decided, okay, do you know what? Let's give this another go. And I had never done that with anybody else in any relationship I was in. And thankfully, that is what happened. And even when we came back together, I think that voice was like, yeah, this feels different. Let's step in. And so I was listening to what I would call in that case, like the wisdom or the intuition or the knowing, whatever word you want to call it. I thought I'd just let you know that something new is coming up in my world in the next couple of weeks, depending on when you're listening to this podcast. It is what I'm told is, you call it an AMA webinar, Ask Me Anything webinar. It's going to be on Thursday, the 25th of November. If you're listening to this after that date, you'll find there's a link in the show notes. It'll probably have the recording of that event. You're very welcome to watch it. It might help. If you hear it in advance, this is something I haven't done before. I can't guarantee anything other than I'll give you my very best of what I know. I'll share stories, I'll share questions, I'll share my own insights and experiences. I'll be very honest. It might be something that just might help you personally, or it might help your business, or indeed it might help your team. And if you'd like to attend, I think the link, it's free. It's in the link in the show notes below. Or you might know somebody connected to you that might benefit. Again, from my own experience of helping people, it could be literally anything: business, sport, life, mindset. Quite happy already. I see some questions coming through. We have a link on the registration page where you can ask a question that's anonymous. So you don't have to put your name on it. So if it's something very personal, that's fine. We won't know. I'll just answer the question for you. And again, we'll try this out as an experiment and see if it helps. But it could be something that really might make a difference to you, I hope. So maybe think about a specific problem or challenge that you find yourself in, or maybe some question that you're really trying to solve. Like, what's your number one challenge? What's your number one problem? What's your number one question that you'd love to ask? This might just strike a chord, and maybe I'll see you there at the Crowdcast. It's I'm being interviewed hosted by Tamara Howard, who's a marketing communications specialist. We can't see anybody who comes in. We might see your name. We can't see any faces. It's not like Zoom. So it's just myself and Tamara having a chat. She'll kind of make sure I don't get off the hook and that I give you proper answers as well, which would be good. So the details, as I say, are in the show notes. So let's get back to this episode. And then I can also relate to a business situation where I was in a business with somebody, and we'd started off with good intentions. It was kind of working well. We both, like, they were a good person, but we just ended up really, I think, having, as I see it now, a divergence of values of how things should be done, or even in terms of where interests lay. And ultimately, I wasn't enjoying it. And so I decided Actually, that's I was just going to say I was outside just leave it. That's not exactly that. The point of the story is that that's not what happened, Shane. What actually happened was I was rationalizing in my head: will I stay? Will I go? Will I stay? Will I go? Will I stay? Will I go? And I went into all this analysis, wrote loads of pages about the pros and cons and what ifs and da da da. But again, I remember just going out for a hike, which is one of my favorite hobbies, and being out for a hike and not even thinking about it. But at one point, it just kind of came in. That voice that, Shane, you just leave. It's the right thing to do. You're going to be okay. Now, that was a thought, but with it came this feeling again, the same feeling that was kind of when I was on the water side with regards to the story with Judy. And I reckon as you're listening to this, you can probably track back in your life, in your career, different moments where you just knew. And so that voice is the voice worth listening to. And for me, that I've often confused clients when I say, look, 95% of what my mind says to me, it's because it's talking all the time. I just don't rate it. I don't listen to it. The 5% really is the bit that I'm really curious in, and that has a certain type of feeling. But it takes practice to get used to that feeling, and also to be willing to go looking for it, because a little bit you're like trying to maybe drill for oil or allow the idea or the intuition to bubble up. So how do you know which voice is speaking? How do you know? Dr. George Pransky, who's somebody I would rate highly on the mental side of life, a practitioner in the US, he has a lovely analogy that I think is very universal. And he says that your inner wisdom is like a flute playing in the background behind a loud brass band. And so the flute's always playing. The brass band is your noisy, busy mind with all the different thoughts and comments about people, circumstances, places, and what it wants to do or what it's worried about. The relentless narration that's coming from that other part of your mind, the part that just doesn't know. And so the gateway to kind of hearing the flute is to kind of get the brass band to calm down, to stop playing, because a calm mind really is the gateway to that wisdom, to that voice. And so once you start to realize that the flute is always there, you don't need to necessarily do anything to get the flute to play. It's always playing. It's always there for you. That's a major, major paradigm shift for most people. And so once you understand that, or at least experiment with that, that assumption, spend time with it. And I know now that, when my inner wisdom, when that part of myself speaks, there's a kind of a very strong knowing and feeling that comes with it. I just kind of know it now. Now, my rational mind might try to go, oh no, don't do that because that's going to be painful, or it's going to be a lot of uncertainty. Don't do it. At the end of the day, though, I've kind of come to trust that when I make decisions from that space, from that knowing, that feeling, that intuition, whatever you want to call it, things always just seem to work out. That's the actual truth. And as I was thinking about this episode, I was reminded of something that I read in a book many years ago. I can't remember who wrote the book, but I remember very distinctly the story, thinking, wow, that's powerful. And the author was writing about, he was in California, that's where he lived, and he was driving on the road, I think out in Malibu. I think the roads are quite twisty, turny. And as he was driving along the road, very calm and clear, just in the moment, with no effort, just enjoying his drive, a very strong inner voice came in and it just shouted at him very quickly, stop the car. And without even thinking, because it was such an extreme thing, he immediately slapped his brake on the car. And literally 1 second later, an articulated lorry came around the corner on the wrong side of the road and just barely missed his car. And he said it was a massive lesson that there is this inner intelligence. There's an inner knowing, and something that's beyond what we can rationalize through our puny minds, really, that knows more than we do, that is connected in a much bigger way to a broader sense of what's going on and the possibilities also. So that's the power of something like this. And I've no doubt that as you're listening to this, if you reflect on it, there's going to be areas in your life you say, actually, you know what, that happened there. I couldn't fully explain it. And that's what I'm talking about. So it's hardwired into you, which to me is a great comfort. So think back to a time when you just knew something. Now, you might not like the decision or liked what it was saying to you about what to do, But think back to that time and maybe you went with it. But think about, how did that thought or idea or insight come to you? And was there a feeling with it? Like, was it a loud voice? Was it a quiet voice? Was it just a thought? I think it comes to people in different ways. That seems to be what I've discovered. It's not the same delivery for everybody. So hopefully that today makes sense. For me, we're touching into an area that's very profound, but very real. And also from my own point of view is really where I see more and more of the opportunity to achieve success that probably is in line with who we really are as people, as leaders. And so your intuition, what I'm saying, your intuition, your wisdom, it's always there in the background, just like that flute. The mental noise, the brass band can drown it out. And that's why a busy mind is actually really bad for business, really bad. And it's very bad for life. Thanks for being with me. Bye-bye.